Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is the Erickson Report. My name is Larry Erickson. I'm going to be your host for the next almost half an hour with some news and views on things that I hope you'll find interesting. We're actually going to start with one of our features. It's called Noted in Passing. Some things that can't get a full lengthy treatment, but were too important to let go by without noting it all. We've got a bunch of them today. But we're going to start with something that I can't say in any way is significant or important because it doesn't reveal anything that was not long since clear, but still it's a lovely little moment. Speaking with reporters on October 4th, Tweetie-pie was asked, obviously, about the infamous phone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. His High Orangeness insisted that the concern had nothing to do at all with Joe Gaff Machine Biden, but it was only about corruption. It was his only concern. So a reporter asked, have you asked any foreign leaders for corruption investigations that did not involve your political opponents? And Tweetie-pie was stumped. He just stared off into the sky and rambled on some blathering about how he was just against corruption. Frankly, I have an enjoyable image of that reporter getting some well-deserved high fives after the cameras were off. All right, next up, people my age may well remember a song called In the Year 2525 by Zager and Evans. The song predicts a rather dystopian future, and the last verse says, now it has been 10,000 years, and now man's reign is through. Well, on October 8th, a controversial dam project was closed and the Tigris River began to rise, and it will continue to until its waters swallow Hasankeyf, which is a small city of about 3,300 people in southeastern Turkey. Okay, so why do we bring up the song in connection with this? Because in it, 10,000 years from now was regarded as seeming like an incredibly long period of time. Well, the city of Hasankeyf has now been inhabited by various human civilizations for at least 12,000 years. It is one of the oldest known human settlements, an historic crossroads of empires and cultures. It's one of the cradles of human civilization, and now it's going to be destroyed. Ultimately, about 15,000 people will have to be removed from the region in order to make room for this dam, and about 300 archaeological sites and settlements will be under the waters of the reservoir. There were attempts to protect the site by having it declared a World Heritage Site, but they failed. The city actually meets 9 of the 10 criteria for such a declaration, but unfortunately the 10th one involves Turkey, the government, having to make a request for it being a World Heritage Site, and since the Turkish government are the very ones who want to drown the city, you can tell how far that got. The dam project has proceeded despite fears that it will spark water wars with countries such as Iraq that are downstream of the new dam and depend on the waters of the Tigris, the flow of which will now be determined by what Turkey decides about the level of its reservoir. For my part, personally, I can't help but wonder if part of Turkey's eagerness to pursue this project has to do with the fact that the people in the region are Kurdish. All right, next up, it's been said that cultural trends in this country have a habit of starting in California. Here are 2 things that make me hope that's true. First, on October 2nd, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law the state's Public Banking Act. This allows cities and counties in California to set up their own public banks. Public, that is, as opposed to private, nonprofit as opposed to profit pursuing. This opens up the prospect of low-income loans for much below what they get in a commercial bank, loans for public projects. The Los Angeles City Council has already said that they're going to look into creating one. There have been efforts to set up public banks in at least 24 states over the years. In fact, this year alone, 4 states, besides California, New York, New Mexico, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, have all introduced legislation to either set up or to explore setting up a public bank. None of these, however, have passed. So the only state or municipally owned bank in the United States remains the Bank of North Dakota, which is a state-owned bank that's been there since 1919. Getting back to California, 9 days after signing that law, Newsom signed a bill that says that as of January 1st, 2020, the State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation will no longer be able to enter into or renew contracts with private for-profit prisons that incarcerate people. The goal is to eliminate private for-profit prisons in the state, including those used for immigration detention, by 2028. Next, it's well established that the IRS audits the poor and the working poor at about the same rate as they audit the richest 1%. In April, Senator Ron Wyden asked IRS Commissioner Charles Rettig for a plan to sort of remedy this rather foolish imbalance. Rettig agreed. Well, the plan came out in September, and it turns out that the IRS isn't going to do anything about this until Congress agrees to restore the funding it has cut from the agency over the past 9 years, something which the Goppers in the Senate have absolutely no intention of doing. The IRS says it uses relatively low-level employees to audit returns for low-income taxpayers, audits which are done by mail and don't involve much staff time. In fact, those people who claim the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, those people made up 39% of all IRS audits last year. On the other hand, the IRS whines, auditing the rich is hard. It takes senior auditors hours and hours to audit an exam. In other words, it's just easier and cheaper to go after the poor rather than the rich. Especially considering that, and something this plan did not address, the rich have the resources to fight back, while the poor just have to pay up and shut up. All right, we have an RIP this time out. On October 6th, Ginger Baker, pioneer of double bass drumming and the drum solo in rock, died at the age of 80. He died of complications arising from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. For most of his life, Ginger Baker was a combative, mostly unpleasant, often nasty SOB. But his music helped to define rock music for a generation and establish the drums as an essential part, an actual instrument in that music. And personally, I can still remember fantasizing about playing the drum solo on the Wheels of Fire version of Toad. So thanks for the music, and R.I.P. Ginger Baker. Montgomery, Alabama is 60% non-white. Despite that, in its 200-year history, it has never had a black mayor. That is, it didn't until October 8th, when Stephen Reed received 67% of the vote in a runoff election. He had actually finished first in the general election, but since he didn't get a majority, there was a runoff, which obviously he won quite handily. There's a special significance to this finally happening in Montgomery. Before the Civil War, Montgomery was a center of the slave trade. It was the birthplace and the first capital of the Confederacy. It was the site of George Wallace's infamous segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech. It was a hub of violent resistance in the civil rights movement, the site of a brutal attack on freedom riders. It's also where Rosa Parks made her stand, and the year-long bus boycott that followed was an early victory in the civil rights movement, and it's also the place where Dr. Martin Luther King emerged as a national leader. It's a sad thing that we still have to celebrate such firsts, and that there are still so many such firsts to achieve. Nonetheless, every first is a victory. It's a step, it's a stair, and so deserves to be celebrated. right, this next thing I've included here largely because of the twist that it involves. Breast cancer is actually pretty rare in men. In fact, it only makes up about 1% of the total number of cases. At the same time, the rate of breast cancer in men has increased by 50% since 1975, while the rate of breast cancer in women, obviously much higher, has actually been declining for the last 20 years. A study just published in JAMA Oncology, JAMA being the Journal of the American Medical Association, a study just published reveals that men have worse outcomes than women in breast cancer. They have worse survival rates for breast cancer. One of the reasons, it appears, is a difference in treatment. Women were far more likely to receive standard of care endocrine therapy for appropriate tumors. Now, there's one twist here, women getting the better care. Here's the other twist. Clinical trials for breast cancer treatments don't include any men. It's become a scandal how women were so often not included in clinical trials under the notion that, as it was expressed, women are just small men. The result was that, to cite, a particularly notorious example, heart disease and heart attacks in women were often notoriously misdiagnosed because women were not included in the clinical studies, and the symptoms of heart disease and heart attacks in women can be significantly different from those in men. But all the research was done on men, so doctors didn't know. Here we have that twist, that opposite, where it was men excluded from the research, leading to men not receiving the best treatment. It's a good reminder of the fact that sexism and assumptions about gender hurt everybody. Finally, for now, according to a new study for the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, which is headquartered at the University of California at Santa Barbara, hate crimes rose 9% in major U.S. cities in 2018. That is the 5th consecutive yearly increase. The most common victims for hate crime reported to police in major cities in 2018 were African Americans, Jews, and LGBTQ people. While extremist homicides decreased markedly in 2018, those committed by white nationalists and the far right rose by a third to make up most of that total. Which, although the report did not say this, I'm prepared to connect to the fact that Jews were the most common direct target of bias and extremist killings in 2018. And in fact, 2018 was the worst year ever for anti-Semitic killings in the United States. It's worthy of particular note that while there are politically motivated assaults attributed to Antifa and the so-called hard left, they committed no racist or bigoted homicides in 2018 or so far in 2019. All right, now moving on to one of our regular features, 2 weeks of stupid, clowns and outrages. And starting as always, our clown this time is the administration of Cape Elizabeth High School in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. Sophomore Ayala Mansman felt that the administration hadn't been doing enough to respond to student concerns about some sexual assaults that had occurred in the school. So on September 16th, she wrote, "There's a rapist in our school and you know who it is," on yellow sticky notes and pasted them around bathrooms in the school. No names were used. There was no identifying information. She said she helped to spark more of a conversation about the sexual assault, and while she may not have gotten that, she did get a reaction. Initially, school officials had assured her mother that there'd be no punishment for this. But after the local paper ran a story on the students' concerns and mentioned Muslim sticky notes, she was pulled out of class in the middle of the day and told she was being suspended for 3 days for bullying. Bullying, that is, through a note containing no way to tell who it was aimed at, or even if it was aimed at a particular person, bullying an unnamed rapist with a sticky note. On October 7th, dozens of students walked out of class to protest her punishment, along with that of 2 other students who were also punished for helping to post the notes. The school, needless to say, whined that sticky notes were not the proper way for students to address their concerns. No, of course not. What they should have done is gone to the administration and then silently accepted being ignored. Suspending students for bullying an unidentified someone or someones because you were embarrassed by a newspaper article about sexual assault at your school, that practically is the definition of a clown. And we'll get to our outrage after our break. And here we are back, and now we move on to our outrage. This is something I've talked about a few times before, but I'm bringing it up again now because there's a particular point I want to make. So we're going to start with 3 examples, among which could be many more. Our first example is a policy known as expedited removal, allows for undocumented immigrants found within 100 miles of the Mexican or the Canadian border who entered the U.S. within the last 2 weeks to be deported quickly without going through immigration courts. Which is bad enough, except that now the Tweetie-pie administration is trying to expand the application of the policy to the entire country and to any immigrant who came into the U.S. without the official papers in the last 2 years. Okay, then there was the ending of the medical deferred action policy, and so beginning to deport people who previously had been protected against deportation because they were receiving medically necessary treatment for serious, even life-threatening conditions. And most recently, we have the vast expansion of who could be denied a green card on the grounds that he might be a public charge. Going from someone who would be primarily dependent on the government to someone who might at some point in the future need government help, such as food stamps, housing vouchers, or subsidized health insurance. And in this case, it's subsidized health insurance. Being on Medicaid counts as a subsidy. Using the Affordable Care Act's subsidized insurance plans, buying that on one of the exchanges, that counts as a subsidy. This is a set of requirements for health insurance that the vast majority of American citizens could not meet. Could you pay for your health insurance completely out of your own pocket? Neither could most of the rest of us. This move to change the standards for a green card could bar roughly 375,000 legal immigrants annually. That's 2/3 of the entire total of immigration. And of course, the impact will not be random. The impact will fall mostly on those who enter through either what Tweetie-pie sneeringly calls chain migration, which is where somebody comes into the country to join family that's already here, and those coming in via the diversity lottery, which essentially means people coming from those shithole countries full of non-white people that Tweetie-pie finds so disgusting. So when they tell you it's about illegal immigration or following the law or securing our borders, that's all utter bull. It is about immigration, period. Immigration of non-white people. People have often spoken about the cruelty of the collection of white supremacist racists populating the White House. Have spoken of the cruelty of the cages, the family separations, the deportation of people who've been here for decades, the cruelty of so many of the policies. Well, here it is. This is the point I wanted to make. We need to recognize and always remember that the cruelty here is not a byproduct of these policies. The cruelty is the point of them. And it is an outrage. All right, finally, for this time out, we take a longer look at the U.S. and the Kurds. The big news of the week, of course, has been the Turkish invasion of northern Syria with the goal of genocide against the Kurds there, an invasion green-lighted by Tweetie-pie, who told Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan that, in essence, yeah, you can go ahead and invade, we'll just get out of the way. Turkey wasted no time attacking a day later. Hundreds are dead, well over 100,000 have fled, and the carnage continues at this moment despite Tweetie-pie's risible proposal that he negotiate a truce and a ceasefire. But What we need to know now is that this is pretty much business as usual for the United States. This is not the first time that we have betrayed the Kurds. In fact, it's at least the 8th. I want you to know that what follows, what I'm going to be talking about here, I'm heavily indebted to John Schwartz at The Intercept, which is a news site I strongly encourage you to check out, theintercept.com. Okay. The morning after his high origin said, in effect, the Kurds, who cares, New York Times columnist Paul Krugman asked on Twitter why Tweetie-pie made this decision. I'm quoting Krugman here. So did Trump just betray the Kurds because A, he has business interests in Turkey, B, Erdogan, being a brutal autocrat, is his kind of guy, C, his boss Vladimir Putin told him to? Remarkable that all three stories are perfectly plausible. However, what Krugman left out of that list is the most likely explanation, D, Trump is president of the United States. Nothing in this world is certain except death, taxes, and betraying the Kurds. Again, as I said, this is not the first time we betrayed the Kurds. It's at least the 8th time since World War I. The Kurds are an ethnic group of about 40 million people ranged across Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Many naturally want their own state, and naturally the countries involved do not want that to happen. So on the one hand, the Kurds are actually a perfect tool for U.S. policy because we can arm the Kurds. We can arm the Kurds in whichever of those countries is currently our enemy, whether to make trouble for that country's government or for some other objective. But on the other hand, we don't want those Kurds to become too powerful because if that happened, the other Kurds, the ones across the border in the country that is our ally, they might get their own ideas about their own freedom and independence. Here's how that dynamic has played out since World War I. Like many other nationalisms, Kurdish nationalism blossomed in the late 1800s. At that point, all of the Kurdish homeland was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, which was centered in present-day Turkey. But the Ottoman Empire collapsed at the end of World War I because it had picked the wrong side in the war. And the Kurds understandably thought, well, this is our chance. The 1920 Treaty of Sèvres completely dismembered the Ottoman Empire, including most of what's now Turkey, and allocated a section for a possible Kurdistan. But the Turks fought back. They didn't want to cede any territory at all in this, and they made enough trouble that the U.S. just gave in and supported a new treaty in 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne. The Treaty of Lausanne allowed the British and the French to carve off present-day Iraq and Syria for themselves, respectively, Iraq for the UK, Syria for France, but it made no allowance at all for the Kurds. This is America's first betrayal, then, of the Kurds. Still, at this point, the main Kurdish betrayals are handled by the British, who crushed the short-lived Kingdom of Kurdistan in Iraq during the early 1920s. And a few years later, the British are happy to see the establishment of Kurdish Republic of Ararat because it was on Turkish territory, but it turned out ultimately that the Turks are more valuable to the British than the Kurds were, so they again just stood by and let the Turks slaughter them. After World War II, the U.S. gradually assumed the British role as main colonial power in the Mideast. We armed the Iraqi Kurds during the reign of Abdul Karim Qasim, who governed Iraq from 1958 to 1963 because Qasim was not following our orders. We supported a 1963 military coup that removed Qasim from power. We immediately then cut off our aid to the Kurds and in fact gave the new Iraqi government napalm to use against them. By the 1970s, the Iraqi government had drifted into the orbit of the Soviet Union. The Nixon administration, led by war criminal Henry Kissinger, hatched a plan with Iran, which was then our ally, it was ruled by the Shah, hatched a plan with Iran to arm Iraqi Kurds to urge them to rise up against the central government in Iraq. The plan wasn't for the Kurds to win, since that might encourage the Kurds and Iran to rise up, but the Kurds weren't told that. They were encouraged to keep fighting. But then the U.S. turned around and signed off on an agreement between the Shah and Saddam Hussein that included our severing aid to the Kurds. The Iraqi military moved north, slaughtered thousands while the U.S. stood by. During the 1980s, The Iraqi government moved on to actual genocide against the Kurds, including the use of chemical weapons and poison gas. The Reagan administration was well aware of Saddam's use of this gas, but because they liked the damage that Saddam was then inflicting on Iran, which is now no longer our ally, during the Iraq-Iran war, it opposed congressional efforts to put sanctions on Iraq. As the U.S. bombed Iraq during the Gulf War in 1991, George H.W. Bush famously called on the Iraqi military and Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside. Okay, so Iraqi Shias in southern Iraq and Iraqi Kurds in northern Iraq both took this message to heart and decided to do exactly that. Turned out, of course, that Bush was lying. The U.S. military stood down as Iraq massacred the rebels in both parts of the country. Because Bush never supported the Kurdish and Shiite rebellions, or for that matter, any democracy movement in Iraq. Saddam's iron fist was holding Iraq together, much to the pleasure of Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And what the U.S. actually wanted was for the Iraqi military, not the people, to rise up and take charge, because then Washington would have what it regarded as the best of all possible worlds, the Saddam Hussein regime, just without Saddam Hussein. Nevertheless, the dying Kurds in Iraq looked so bad on international television that the Bush administration was forced to do something and eventually supported what was started as a British effort to offer some protection to the Kurds in Iraq. During the Clinton administration in the 1990s, these Kurds, the Iraqi Kurds, they were the good Kurds because they were persecuted by Iraq, our enemy. They were worthy of U.S. sympathy. But the Kurds a few miles away, a few miles north in Turkey, started getting uppity, and since they were annoying our ally, they were the bad Kurds. The U.S. sent Turkey huge amounts of weapons, which it used with U.S. knowledge to murder tens of thousands of Kurds and destroy thousands of villages. It's worth noting here that until 1991, it was illegal to speak Kurdish in Turkey, and it was illegal to teach it in schools until 2012. Before the Iraq War in 2003, right-wing pundits were saying that as we had to go to war to help the Kurds. But the post-war regional autonomy of Kurds upset Turkey. So in 2007, the U.S. allowed Turkey to make bombing runs into Iraq against Iraqi Kurds, at which point the right wing was now saying this is exactly what America needed to be doing. With Trump's thumbs up to another slaughter of the Kurds, America is now in betrayal number 8. Whatever you want to say about U.S. actions with regard to the Kurds, you can't deny we're consistent. The Kurds have an old famous adage that says they have no friends but the mountains. Now more than ever, it would be hard to argue that that's wrong. That's it for this week. We're out of here. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, you have the best couple of weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.